really is great to be here, and I think our topic today is something that all of us can relate to on many levels, because I'm suspecting that everybody here has some agendas. And I suspect that you have had a little bit of pushback here and there when you have tried to advance those agendas. And the idea of sort of creating this buy-in, this belief behind the agenda that you can move it forward in a way that ultimately really advances what you're trying to accomplish as a change agent and as a leader. That's really, when we talk about leadership, there are a lot of definitions out there. I have found that leadership may be the most written about topic out there, at least as it relates to interpersonal relationships, in part because I suspect we don't really know exactly what it is, and no matter how many people, very, very smart people, are out there talking about it, there's always that personal application, there's always that specific set of circumstances, and we kind of wonder, how can we grab that magic formula and apply it in our environment to ultimately achieve the goals we want to achieve as leaders? And we have a lot of goals, because we want to do great things. That's why you're in the business. In fact, I'm very envious. I love what I do, which is now coaching and consulting work, but I also am envious of all of you because you are in the proverbial trenches and you are making a difference every day. The only way that I can provide solace for myself is that in conversation with people like you, I hope to be making a difference to the community at large. But you're really working with those populations, not only the children, but the teachers and the parents and other members of your school community. And so your vision, your influence, your agendas, these are all very, very important. And it's extremely important as a topic for us to try to understand that better. All right, here we go. So the first item we're going to talk about is setting a healthy agenda. Right? There are a lot of agendas out there. Some of them are healthier than others. And we're going to have to define what healthy means. Healthy is going to include, a lot of much of what we're going to talk about at the beginning relates to setting the foundation for success. A lot of the back, preliminary conversation that's going to ultimately allow you to have a successful roll-up whenever it is that you do actually bring your ideas to bear with other people. Okay? So here's a question for you right off the bat. What is an agenda? Would anyone like to offer some kind of working definition or at least some components? Please?
What you plan to cover?
Okay. So you're thinking about it in what sense? You used the word cover. So what do you mean?
Discuss.
So for like a meeting?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I guess that's what I'm thinking about.
So would it be fair to say like a meeting plan?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Anyone else? Please?
Along those lines, a roadmap
Okay,
towards intended outcomes.
great. Okay, you want to provide an example perhaps of something that you've been involved with recently that fits that definition? I don't want to put you on the
Sure.
spot.
Curriculum mapping.
Curriculum, beautiful. Okay. Anyone else? Thank you, that was great. I'm
Okay.
sorry to put you on your toes like
No,
that. My
That's
apologies.
what I got to say.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, I wasn't ready for that, and I totally understand. Thank you, yes.
There's usually a schedule sometime.
Okay, great. So these are I think pretty much spot on to what I'm going to present for you here, which is a list, a plan, an outline, something similar used to get things done. Right? You want to advance a conversation, you want to achieve some kind of vote, things like that. It's a pretty standard definition. You'll find it basically in any dictionary. So when agenda is expressed like this, it may be very neutral. I didn't get any sense from the body language in the room that you had any issue with the term expressed this way. But when we express it as having an agenda, then all of a sudden we seem to have a different reaction. Would anyone like to elaborate on why you turned your thumb down? Clearly you had something in mind. He has an agenda, she has an agenda. What's his agenda? Yes?
It doesn't seem collaborative, like
Okay.
it's already been decided.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
it's not a choice, and you're moving forward with it.
Okay, so I'm going to make a line over here. I'm just going to write for now, lacks collaboration. Which, by the way, in today's day and age, as you probably all know, is an expectation. Right? It's an expectation from our teachers that they should have a voice in how our schools are operating. It's an expectation from our parents to be able to have a voice in how things are operating. There are very few schools today that can operate pretty much in that proverbial bubble or vacuum where they don't need to be regularly gaining that input from their constituents and finding out what people want. Anyone else want to elaborate? Yes?
There's a lack of transparency, I think,
Uh-huh.
connoted by it, that you might be talking about one thing, but there's an undercurrent of some kind of agenda that the person has.
So like you're hiding something?
Yeah.
Okay.
And that kind of connotation.
Yes, certainly. Okay, so what we have to do, I don't think when you walk into any agenda-related conversation, you necessarily use the term. It's not like you're saying, oh, here's my agenda, per se. You might say it for a meeting, but in a normal circumstance, you're not going to use the term as you are trying to advance an idea or consider a change. But we do need to realize that right away our topic is filled with potential landmines. And that alone is important to keep in mind. By the way, when we talk about agenda setting, another way to refer to it is change management. And change management is a very important topic out there. You know, it's relevant to education, but it's relevant to business management and organizational management. And I would argue, even though I know that culturally we live in very unique bubbles, in a sense. You know, a school culture is different than a business culture. It is different. And there are a lot of traditions, there are a lot of values that are unique to the educational personnel and population that will not necessarily be relevant to those who are in business, who are more, let's say, profits-driven and things like that. But there are a lot of things we can learn, you know, from successful business enterprises as well. So when we talk about change management, and we're going to refer to it very shortly, specifically through the research of one individual who's well-known and well-accomplished, you know, I think the transference is relevant to us. Okay, so jumping right into the question, here's a think, pair, share question for you. And I think that we're divided kind of nice and neat for that purpose. Maybe you'll have to decide which way you're going to swing for this conversation. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to read this passage over here. You'll see at the bottom it's from John Kotter, who is a leading professor, a Harvard professor, and a leading expert in the area of change management. And I'd like you to read it, and then together in your small groups, I'd like you to answer the 3 questions that are there at the bottom. Okay, so in the interest of moving along our agenda, I thought I would ask for some feedback. Would anyone like to tackle number 1? What rough approximate percentage emerged from your understanding of the passage?
At less than 50%.
Less than 50%. How much less? If you had to put a number to it.
I just threw out 33,
33%?
because I got a sense of, you know,
Okay.
it's either one
Okay.
way or the other, and some in
Okay,
between, so.
fine. You can
So
go up or
just-
down a little bit, but clearly 33% is not a very, unless you're a baseball player, 33% is probably a low percentage. Okay? Anyone, any comments on that before we move forward? Anything that, would you say that you were surprised to read that? Is that something you would have predicted or expected? Anyone want to elaborate? We could later, for a small extra fee, that's okay. All right, for number 2, anyone? Volunteer to answer number 2. What are the primary pitfalls associated with change management? You don't have to give a complete answer. You can give me a piece of it, and we can piece it together if you'd like. Skipping steps, okay.
Just the pace of change.
They're going too fast.
Okay, skipping steps is 1. Pace, all right.
Fear of the unknown.
Speed, watch out, change in the way, flying
Fear of
through.
the unknown.
Fear of the unknown. Can you elaborate, please, on that?
Well, I think that people are afraid of change. They are
Yes.
very settled.
Yes,
And they don't know what to expect.
yes,
Just, very basically.
that is very
Yeah.
true. We are creatures
we're
creatures of habit.
Absolutely.
We are.
And that centers
Yes.
down to, having everyone on board. You need
Uh-huh.
to have everybody on board with the change.
So developing consensus, or the absence of consensus, is that what you're saying? By the way,
The absence of resistance.
not every change, and not every leadership guru does believe that consensus is necessary. They do believe that you have to develop at least maybe a majority, sort of like this general movement in that direction. There's a book, the name, I think the author The author has a long last name, it might be Italian, I'm not sure, but the book itself is called Five Dysfunctions of a Team. You might want to get your hands on it. It's a nice read, it's not dense, it sort of has this narrative flow to it, and it recreates change management processes through the perspective of a Silicon Valley upstart that is having some challenges, having some issues. And there he talks about that you don't necessarily have to have everybody, if you try to gain full consensus, you probably will never get anywhere, depending on the size of your staff.
Majority.
But at least you have movement in that right direction, okay? So I'll use the word consensus for now, but with that little introduction, hopefully we all understand what we mean by it. Anything else as to why we didn't work?
Not revising, like
Okay.
taking pause and looking at as you're going.
So
through
no
the
stop
phases.
and reflect,
Right.
okay? Maybe, I wonder if that's part of pace, or if that's just, it may or may not have to be, but I'm gonna connect them a little bit because they can be related. The idea of not pausing, all right? So I'm sort of committed to this process, and I'm a bull in a china shop. I'm gonna make this happen by hook or by crook. And sometimes we do need to take a step back and see, is it actually what we envision it would be? But typically speaking, it's not going to be. In some way, shape, or form, of course, depending on the size of the program and what it is that you're trying to accomplish, it could really morph into something very different. And taking the time to really step back, think about, well, what did we envision? What is it becoming? Are we comfortable with this new direction? Can we live with it? Do we want to bring it back? All these questions you could be asking yourself, of course, as you go. Yes, did you want to say
I was
something?
just going to say not enough transparency.
Okay,
So
Okay.
if
So-
you're not open and
Right.
transparent with what's happening.
okay, so I'm going to write transparency, but I'm also going to maybe orally add communication as well. Could be something to consider. We'll talk about this later, right? But people will fill voids with their fears in most cases. So if you don't fill the void with information and with good information, even if that information is, we made a mistake, but we're aware of our mistake and this is what we're doing about it, right? You might have heard in the news today that Bluebell Ice Cream is recalling all of its products, Michelle, all throughout the country because of a concern over some type of bacteria or some contamination. Now, I've never had Bluebell ice cream, but I'm sure it's delicious, and it's certainly very costly to do that. But they acknowledge that there is a problem, and this is what we're doing about it. So if I was a customer of theirs, I'd feel confident in their leadership to know that when they are putting their products back on the shelf, they've done their due diligence to make sure that everything is in order the way that it needs to be. Excellent. Any final points or comments on number 2 for now? There'll be plenty of time to talk about it further. That's really why we're here.
I think going back to how you began, something about the agenda is sticking with me. Something about sort of, knowing based on the way in which you're formulating your need for change, data, all of that, and then how you roll that out in your agenda, making it an agenda versus my agenda. Has something to do with pacing, but I
Okay.
get stuck in that because of the strategic planning
Yeah.
aspect of leadership and
Yeah.
the agenda feeling.
A lot of things are popping through my head as you're talking, so I'm trying to figure out where you're going specifically, but one thing that kind of resonated with me is the idea of having a set of values. We're gonna come back to this, but the more that you are values driven, the more, and when I say values, you have to have your own personal values, of
Right.
course, but you also, I would think, wanna really establish organizational values, institutional values. Some of them, if you go to a website, and I think I might have it on one of our handouts, we'll see that a little bit later. You'll see usually a short list of 4, 5, 6 values, everything from diversity to providing, a basic strong education to all constituents, whatever that might look like. But then you're probably going to have a longer list of values. And regardless of how you set that up, that can be very important because then it creates less of this personality component. And the more that I can attach an agenda to a person, the more my emotional sense of who that person is and how I relate to her is going to cloud or muddle my perspective of the agenda as opposed to looking at the agenda for the agenda's sake. In other words, you want to create as much objectivity around the agenda as you can so that people can look at it for what it is rather than to try to redefine it based on who's driving it or who seems to be behind it. And we'll talk more about this, but it is going to be, John Maxwell talks about this, it's extremely hard to separate the leader from her agenda. It's extremely hard. So relationships are crucial, and we'll come back to that as well. But at least if you have a set of values that people have bought into, then you're no longer about me versus you and the power struggles. We're being driven by the same set of goals, whether we did it based off of a complete consensus or a majority that the minority has to live with because we voted and this is the direction we've chosen. This is going to make your life a lot easier because then it's not about that personal contentions dimension that might exist. Thank you, appreciate it. Anything else for number 2? Yes?
Well, I mean, not related to number 2, but what you just said, I think there's a fine line, there's a balance between, I think if people trust you,
Uh-huh.
you can probably buy in, like they might buy in and not have as much fear.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know how, it's hard for me to reconcile like completely taking the agenda and making it solely objective
Uh-huh.
when presenting it and getting people's buy-in.
Sure, sure. I don't think you can make it fully objective, but at least by having values, it's going to help you. I did add communication and trust to the issues of lacking things that will contribute as a result of not having them. Excellent. And number 3. So Cotter was talking about corporations. Now, as you, I'm sure, are aware, corporate America has gone through a lot of changes over the last, let's say, 3-4 decades. Everything from technological transference, the notion of being more international in many ways, thank you so much, and just reconceiving how the organization is structured, reporting, telecommuting, all these kinds of things. So thinking about it now from a school's perspective, clearly we're much more local. We're not dealing with international, other than maybe a little bit of our technology and things like that. We're really very much centered in our communities. But that said, how do these issues apply in your environment, in school environments in general? Would anyone like to comment on that? Yes?
Well, I think that if all of these things, we need the buy-in from faculty if we're making changes, whether it's curricular or whether it's divisional or bringing in new ideas, you have to have buy-in from faculty. And I think they need time to hear what the goal is, time to discuss, and then that would bring them more closely aligned to what your goal is.
Beautiful. Thank you. Anyone else?
I thought it was interesting that you used the word cultural change, because schools don't like their culture to be changed.
Right.
A cultural shift is not really welcome.
Okay.
And that's
But cultural shifts are happening. Cultural shifts are happening. Does anyone have examples of cultural shifts in your schools or schools that you're aware of that you'd like to share? Something that may have even engendered some of the resistance that Irene is talking about?
I'm happy to share the way in which we decorate our lobbies and things at holiday times, with a very diverse school. Do we know who we are anymore? And so everything's come under such scrutiny.
Right.
We were laughing before even, if I had a little scooter running through the building, I don't think I could decorate with holiday lights and more and things like that. It's not culturally, and that was a big part of our culture, but so it's a big change, It's just, never really realized how much what we display really affected so many,
Sure.
So that's been we can't just do what we always did anymore. We have to really analyze everything, make sure everybody's included.
You're
So it's
right.
been tricky.
We're
Yes,
not
please.
there yet, but it's close.
Right.
We've gone from rewarding longevity in terms of compensation to performance.
Oh, I'm sure your senior staff love that. That can be challenging, but that is a lot of what our consumers want today. A lot of our parents are no longer satisfied with yesterday's excellence, whatever that might have looked like. They have a different perspective entirely of what and they're using a different paradigm by which to measure it. And so we have to broaden our own perspective. I think it's particularly true for the millennial population. I think that's going to grow even more. They beat, they beat to a very different type of drum in many ways in terms of what they value and what we might call respect for the workplace, both in the corporate world as well as in a space such as ours. So that's something to think about as we move forward. How are we connecting with that next generation of parents and children? Because clearly the parental values will make their way to the children as well. Yes?
I think that's something that we all are faced with,
Yes.
is our role now as schools, as administrators, educating our parents more. I mean,
Yeah.
yes, we're educating their children,
Yes,
and I do think that we are becoming more of a business where we provide
Right.
service.
right.
That we are consumer driven because we need clientele,
Sure.
and we have to provide the service
Sure.
to the best of our ability. But I do think that these parents now, their expectations, as you said, are different.
Right.
And we have to be willing to change.
Yeah.
And again, going back to the parent education piece,
Uh-huh.
I'm sure we could all come up with scenarios where we spend a lot of our time educating parents.
Love it.
We have a parent, developed a parent program.
Uh-huh.
We've probably all got some form of a parent program.
Sure.
We've done a lot more of it this year.
Is it, if I may interject for a second, is it, I guess what I might call lecture driven, as in you bring in presenters
It
or
varies.
you offer workshops, things like that? Or is it more like small group conversational? All the above.
I try to do something different every semester, every term,
Okay.
just to see what works best.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know on that one. I have not researched it, but my gut tells me that, again, with this younger population, that more of the intimate conversation where they have real input would be valuable to them. In other words, getting parents to come to a lecture is exceedingly difficult. Exceedingly difficult. A, because everybody's either real or imagined pressed for time. We may not really be pressed for time. I find 3 hours to watch last night's hockey game, but did I find 20 minutes to come to sit at conferences with the teacher? It's all relative to what we value. That's the reality. But at the same time, coming to parenting lessons may be as fun as going to the dentist, that pre-root canal evaluation, that kind of thing. Some people might feel that way. So we have to do whatever we can to make it as engaging as we can. And I think the more that it's interesting though, it's not relevant really to our conversation, but I was researching recently. I did a talk at an advancement conference. And one of the things that I did a little bit of research on was the success of the Ice Bucket Challenge.
Yes.
You might be familiar last
Oh,
year.
yeah.
It was huge. And the amount of money that was raised for Lou Gehrig's disease was beyond anything that they've even come close to experiencing before. And so I was looking at websites that were talking about why was it so popular. And one of them had to do with the fact that it was very much ready for social media. It was an easy thing to record yourself and put yourself on Facebook. That was a piece of it. But there was this sort of interpersonal component to the process. I'm doing it and sort of I'm motivating you to do it. So the more that your parents can take ownership of the parenting process, the more that maybe they could be in charge of either committees or driving small conversational groups or things like that they could then bring others into their little world, as opposed to it all coming from us, where we're trying to reach out and we just have, besides the fact that we're so stretched, we don't have a lot of time, we don't have a lot of resources. So what do? You put out a flyer, you send out an email, maybe you do one of these calling post type of things, and you do the best you can, and you get 5% or 10% of your parents, and you consider yourself fortunate. In most cases, that's what it is. We pat ourselves on the shoulder and we say, okay, we did parenting. But the reality is that we need to be able to consider what's going to bring people to the table. And I think that for all of this, that's important. So it's something certainly to think about. This is really great. Anything else for number 3? I know we have to move forward, but I certainly don't want to cut a good conversation short. Anything else that when you sort of make the transference from corporate to school environment that jumps out at you?
What jumped out at me was the importance of laying out key steps and going through the process.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
rushing that or skipping steps.
Uh-huh.
tends to
Is there
cause
anything in
domino
particular
effect.
that comes to mind when you say that? Anything that you experienced, maybe even when you were a teacher, I'm making an assumption that you were once in the classroom, anything that you observed that you felt like, had we taken more time, it would have resulted in a better way? Does anyone like to comment on that?
I think a new approach to teaching math, or a new
Uh-huh.
approach, you know, it's like du
So what
jour,
was skipped?
training, you
Uh-huh.
know, relearning,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
unlearning,
Yeah.
all of the steps
Oh
of
my,
of
yes.
learning
Yes.
for, you know,
Training is tough,
yeah,
especially because we rely so much on that August week.
and then
Yeah, that
revisiting
pre-
it.
Yeah, revisiting it and finding the time. All of that's really important. Wow, okay, great.
I know
So-
this sounds
Yes.
silly, but what I'm finding, you know, in my longevity as an educator too, is what's different in schools versus businesses is there has to be sort of, and this is gonna sound Pollyannic,
Uh-huh.
but a sort of joy about the work in
Sure.
schools. And I think when that is being shoved out for the business aspect,
Uh-huh.
I think that concerns me.
Right,
Because if children aren't, you know, our most important consumers is often not thought about in
Uh-huh.
these business decisions, and then we won't have clientele, because if you're not happy in school, you're not going to have a school. And that concerns me, because it's harder and harder to have fun.
it is.
It's hard to find the balance.
Yeah, for me anyway, I
No,
can't speak for everybody.
There's a book called If You Don't Feed the Teachers,
Teachers, They'll Eat the
They'll Eat the
Students.
Students. You're familiar
Right.
with that?
Yeah, I
Okay, it sort of captures that idea. I had one colleague in a school that shall go unnamed, not because the school did anything wrong, but she had this knack for counting down, and counting down to the next vacation, counting down to the end of the year. And I would turn to her and I'd say, look, you know, I get the fact that vacation is enjoyable, but it really doesn't seem right. You know what I mean? It really
Right.
seems like you need to be, you know, enjoying what you're doing and really having that enthusiasm. And that's something to think about. I'll mention this not because it involves me, but because of the message behind it. I had a student when I used to teach ninth grade at an independent school in Chicago. And this was a Judaic studies class, and it was prophets. Now, I could probably list prophets in terms of overall enthusiasm and interest, not in the top three, let's just say it like that, okay? Now, this boy was in my class for 4.5 days a week, let's say. His Friday periods were shorter, and the schedule was more tight because of the Sabbath. And he came to our school for a year, freshman year, and then he left because he had come from, if you're familiar within the Jewish spectrum, there's Orthodox and conservative and Reform, etc. He was really conservative by upbringing, had gone to such a school, an elementary school, but Chicago at the time there wasn't such a school to continue into high school. So many of the graduates came to us, which was modern Orthodox, many went on to public school, etc. I believe for his sophomore year, such a school was founded. I knew it was around then, and he transferred out of our school to go to that one. I did not see him then for 3 years. And I saw him again at the graduation of his former classmates. Meaning to say, my students were now seniors. When they graduated, they had a program, and he attended as their friend and as their former classmate. And so he said to me at the time that as a senior, he was asked to write about, I don't know if it was about a teacher or just an adult. And he said that he had written about me. Now, I was pretty surprised by that, because I was an adult that I guess either made an imprint on you, something like this. And I said, you know, in my mind, I said, I barely knew the boy, you know, because he was in my class, like I said, for a relatively short period, and then he was no longer there. I said, why did you write about me? He said, because when you were teaching, you were always having fun. That's what he said. Made me feel good. But more importantly, it's a lesson for all of us as educators. You know, sometimes the job can be so, what's the word I'm looking for? It could put us down. You know, there's people complaining, teachers are griping, students are not behaving, things are not what we want it to be. And we have that Pollyannic sense of what it should look like, and the reality often tells a different story. But if we can maintain our enthusiasm, if we can maintain our energy, if we can continue to smile through the challenges, then not only will we be more memorable as a person, but you never know what kind of impact you make. You know, there are a lot of people that go into education probably for one of two reasons. Either because they had a great teacher, or because they had a lot of lousy teachers, and they want to make a difference in the field, you know, that kind of thing. But the more that we can make that connection, the more that we hope to create not only great citizens, but hopefully people who will give back, you know, to our society. So that's a nice thing. Okay, so jumping right along, I think we covered this idea very well. Here you have some of the points, and by the way, as far as the handout, may I take a look for just a second, just the one minute. Okay, we should be looking now at this space, I guess, right above the table, because we're going to get a chance to talk about the agenda soon. So you have over here not understanding the nature and process of change, right? What is the impact of change? I remember once about 3 years ago, I went to a special evening session with a consultant when I was a head of school down in Atlanta. And the people in attendance were heads of school and board chairs. So it was you and your board chair, and you sat together with that person, and all the schools in this particular group were represented that way. I don't remember a thing that the consultant talked about, not a thing. Okay, but one. And it was a slide that was entitled the following: Hills that heads die on. Yeah, how's that for an upper?
Yeah.
Okay, and what was on that list? Things like reversing the carpool line, you know, or other little things that just seem so petty. But we have to understand what will be the impact. You know, I'm thinking about, and you float the idea out there. What do you think will be the impact if we were to ABCD? Something along those lines. That could be a real game stopper right off the bat. Some of you mentioned this, not creating the groundswell, right? The sense that this is an important item. Change for its own sake is usually very bad, unless there's an obvious benefit. So for example, if we're going to make an improvement to the grounds of the school, most people will be happy with that unless you don't develop trust. I'm going to give you an example. My first year in Atlanta, I came to a school. It was a beautiful school. It had been rebuilt from an existing structure that unfortunately had been condemned, not well taken care of. Half the building was knocked down and rebuilt, and the parking lot was one of the areas not so focused on during this rebuild process. And the faculty lot in particular was not so in such great shape. So about 2/3 of it was paved properly, and this area towards the back was not very well paved. And if you've been down to Georgia, you know that the soil there is not like it is up here. Here it's brown, and when it gets wet it becomes blackish. We call that mud. In Georgia it's like clay, like rust color. So it's really yucky because it just, you know, it's one thing to get some dirt and you wash off, but then you get this discoloration. So I had all these teachers, and they were forced, some of them, to park way in the back because not everybody could find a spot right away. And on top of it, your tires get this really rusty orange type color, etc. Not a great situation. Now, in the grand scheme of things, it's not the biggest deal in the world. Certainly if we have funding, we might need to prioritize differently. But we happen to have some money available specifically for building-related improvements, and we did that. Now, in general, it was received well, because people obviously had a better place to park. But there were some people, because I was relatively new and had not yet built that trust, who started to question me, and of course at faculty meetings, never in a proper context, always at a faculty meeting in front of everybody, right? Well, how did we have the money to afford that, but we couldn't manage to afford faculty benefits that we've been promised for 17 years, or who knows what, right? You may have had such a question like that. So even if the idea is a good idea, and you might say this is a no-brainer, it's not always a no-brainer. And it's something to think about. You know, for a while there was a commercial with this guy from the mortgage industry, and he used to say, the biggest no-brainer in the history of Earth. You ever hear that commercial? As you hear all the time. So it sounds like this is the biggest no-brainer. Sometimes it is, but I would still float it out there and see, you know, what people might say. Right? Patience, like we talked about before, right? Patience, and I would add maybe fortitude, persistence. How many times have you rolled out a new idea at your beginning of year professional development, like differentiated instruction, or universal use of technology, whatever that might be, and you bring in a couple of speakers, and by November it's like you never even heard of the term before. This is not about me, not us, right? Because life got in the way, and there's, you know, parent-teacher conferences, and there's all sorts of other things that have to happen, and the sports season is, you know, up and running, and this, that, and the other, and 2 teachers quit on me, and so we lose sight of it, right? But you need to know that barring a natural disaster, that when you go into a change initiative, that A, you're going to have a lot of patience, and B, you have to have the process behind it that's ultimately going to see it to fruition and fulfillment. There's probably nothing worse than starting change and not finishing change, other than starting bad change. But even if it's good change and you don't finish it, you create this impression amongst your staff that, oh, here she goes again, and the eyes begin to roll, right? We know what that looks like, and then they will never give you that type of investment that you want because you've proven over time that you can't stay on top of it till the end, to see work. And then to revisit it. Somebody here talked about revisitation, very important. I personally would recommend when it comes to PD, sort of like a 5-year plan. Now, I know that education is so hard because it's a changing field like so many others. And things that we don't even know exist today may be front and center next year or 2 years from now. But to the best of our ability, knowing what we know about education, develop, a 5-10-year plan even, knowing that there's going to be a lot of churn, knowing that you might not even be in your current position then for whatever the reason, but at least you set your institution on a path to success that builds in opportunity for review, opportunity for growth and enhancement, while also introducing new things. Otherwise, it just feels very shallow and not supported. And that can be very frustrating for people. Any questions or comments? Okay, jumping right ahead then. Now, I don't think we're going to be able to do this because of time. We've had some great conversation. I'm just going to share with you a finished version. You have this in front of you. But eyeball it please for 60 seconds while we're looking at it together. I want you to think about, because we've been talking a lot about agendas, sometimes it's important to realize that there are a lot of other agendas going on, whether we want to really spend time thinking about it or not. Okay? So what I would like for you to at least briefly consider are what are other agendas, because by the way, that's part of this process. Change management doesn't always mean that the idea begins with me. Change management often means I take advantage of existing interest in something and I channel it towards a positive outcome. Does that make sense? I'll give you an example. Okay, how many of you are familiar with PBIS? You're familiar. Okay, super. Hi, nice to meet you.
Hi.
Would you like to tell everybody a little bit about it?
Sure, it's a student behavior management system.
Okay, great. So PBIS is something that I had been learning about when I was in Atlanta at a principal's fellowship type program. And for those of you not familiar, it's values-based. You can look it up, by the way. It's pbis.org. They have an office in every state in the country and beyond. And you create a set of values that are going to drive expectation for student conduct. So let's say respect is a value. Okay? Responsibility might be a value. Things like this. So around the time that I was learning about PBIS, getting interested in it, thinking about it for our school, I had a number of teachers, seemingly almost like miraculously, start knocking on my door, complaining to me about student conduct and how they were becoming more and more disappointed with certain parts of our school population and how they were behaving and what can we do about it, and you need to deal with it.
Yeah.
You ever had that before?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and you need, right, they drop it very neatly on your lap and say goodbye, I'll check in you in a little bit, let's see how we've made progress. So that was an example. I don't want to get into all the specifics of how we made it happen, but that was the beginning of conversation that ultimately resulted in a launch in our school of a program that was PBIS based in terms of its core concepts. To the point where I had one gentleman on staff who was of the, it doesn't matter which part of the staff he was on, but he was a very central person within our team and a very vociferous, outspoken individual. I didn't always agree with this person on a lot of issues, and it happened to be well into the process, right around the launch time. We started talking about it in May. We didn't launch it until November. And we needed a lot of time to build the committee, to establish all the, let's call it the verbiage and the ideas and all of this, to bring it to the staff, to get their buy-in, in and out of committee, the whole to-do. And right around the time that we were going to launch, this person still could not come to peace with the fact that we were doing this. To him, it was a waste of time. Our kids don't behave so bad, I don't see that issue, it doesn't happen with me, I don't have that problem, right? You ever have a teacher like that? We all have a problem with it, okay? And so another teacher, a female, who is not typically the kind of person to speak up at faculty meetings. She turns to him and she says, we already talked about this. We agreed to this. Let's move on. And to me, that was so affirming. Not only that the agenda had been accepted, but that I didn't have to fight that bad, right? You want somebody to rescue you sometimes at a faculty meeting, and that was a great opportunity. Not because of something that I did personally, but because of something that we had done together. So in thinking about agendas, there really are a lot. And being strategic about what those agendas are, what the likelihood of success is, how important it is, all of these, we're going to talk about making a case for change a little bit later. But when we know what's going on in our building, that could be very valuable for us. So again, because of the amount of time that we don't have at the moment, I'm going to skip this slide and just give you a sample of what it may look like. Okay? Now, this was, the word academic is cut off over here, I'm sorry. But there are some, and by the way, this doesn't include, there's a constituency, donors. Donors are not reflected over here, but easily could be. Yeah, your donors have interests too. They may not be your parents. Okay? So here, for example, you want to roll out some academic things, skills-based learning, social emotional programming. Maybe your board wants to see better evaluative tools for the administration. Right? We don't know how to evaluate you, or we don't know exactly if we have the best administrative structure. We want you to deal with that. I don't know if you've ever been tasked to something like this, but in my school it was me as head of school, there was an assistant head of school, and because we had a Judaic and a general study department, we had a general studies principal. So it was sort of like not a clear pyramid or a triangle that didn't exactly align. There was a little bit of confusion of who did what. And so they wanted a mechanism that I was supposed to create for them that would help them evaluate us and also help me evaluate my administrative team. Okay? That might be an academic-related board agenda. They typically don't have too many of those, but they want to see excellence, right? They want to see strong tests. They want to see these kinds of things. Whatever these agendas are, some of this might look familiar to you. And of course, your students are going to have a very different set of agendas than most of the rest of us. Okay? So, I present these here. Does anyone have any comments, by the way, on this? Just as a group, anything in particular here? No? Okay. But I included this slide because I wanted to realize that whenever we talk about these items, we have to think about what's of interest to me, both in terms of making me feel like I'm making a difference. We all want to make a difference. I also want to be viewed very positively by my board and by my community. I want to be viewed as a winner, right? And more importantly, I want to stay on the job for a while. We all have that self-preservation in us, I hope. So we have things that we want to say we accomplished, but at the same time, there are a lot of things out there that are other constituents want. And this column, I think, is particularly important, the one about the teachers. Because at the end of the day, we all know they're the front lines of everything that we do. We cannot succeed if we don't have good teachers who are committed and who are passionate about what they're doing. And a lot of that culture, a lot of that motivation, a lot of that enthusiasm comes from their relationship with us and how they feel themselves to be supported by us. So we walk a fine line because they want, let's say, certain things that are going to cost the school money. You have to go make the ask to the board, or you have to go make the ask to a donor, or you have to do something else that's going to put you out there and get pushback, right? So you have to decide also how are you going to help to advance that. So we have a lot going on. There's no question about it. This is not an easy job. I think they probably told you that. They probably told you that. But knowing this part is certainly going to make it a little bit easier. Okay. Any questions or comments?
I think that's a
Oh, sorry.
really interesting dynamic because a lot of our schools have had new leadership, and I think quite a few have had, well, not so much on me, but maybe not so much on Nicole, but with the new leadership, there are ongoing agendas that have been started, and they're interwoven, and then the new person comes in, and they may not be aware of those other layers. It's really interesting to see it kind of on a chart like this. You could almost do that as an exercise within your school. How many initiatives, how many agendas, how many goals are we working on?
I think this could be extremely powerful. Thank you for that. I will tell you that when I started in Atlanta, the school where I was working was a relatively small school with a wide base of parents and philosophies and things like that. More importantly, my predecessor had been on the job for 16 years and had built the school from a very small school, let's say 50, 60 students, to its, at the time, present population of 340. So it had grown exponentially under his leadership. The community had grown, and it had grown with him. And he was a very different personality than me, much more outgoing in some ways. Now, I'm one of those, if you take the Briggs-Myers personality test, I'm one of those corner, hardcore introverts. I don't know if you have a working definition, but an introvert is not somebody who's necessarily shy, but it's more somebody who is, it's a misnomer. It's somebody who gets their energy from, well, extroverts get their energy from others, being with other people. They enjoy being in a social setting. Introverts would like to crawl into a corner with a book or a computer or something like this and sort of be more self-reflecting and whatnot. And so I think he was pretty much a type A extrovert, and I was sort of a type Z, if there is such a thing, introvert. And so he, to me, I kept the door open because I felt I needed to. But I would much rather have my door closed where I could sit and think and not have to be out there all the time. And there were a lot of other issues. More importantly, there were a lot of buried agendas, or dormant, maybe dormant is a better word, dormant agendas that people on the board would have wanted to see happen and advance. But he was a couple of years from retirement. He was over 70 years old at the time, had the energy of a 20-year-old, but it was over 70 at the time. And whatever they said or wanted to do, it just didn't happen. And so, of course, the new guy will be the Messiah, and he'll deal with all these issues. But the problem is that nobody told this to the teachers. So here I am thinking I need to go ahead and advance all of these really robust agendas, which were made very clear to me by, of course, the search committee. The search committee is asking me all these questions. Well, what would you do about this? Right? That told me everything about what was on their mind. They're not going to ask me questions about things that work. They're going to ask me questions about things that are broken, right? So that was clear to me that I needed to do A, B, C, D, deal with the tenured staff that really didn't deserve to be there anymore or needed an upgrade, whatever those issues were. And then not being maybe sophisticated enough or experienced enough, I had some of my challenges in trying to satisfy those who wanted to see the change with those who were very comfortable with the status quo. And that's another piece you have to really understand. Right? Teachers weren't interested in changing, they were just interested in benefits. They wanted better security, they wanted a better parking lot, they wanted more supervision in the hallways. They wanted the things that would make their job easier, and that makes sense. They also wanted professional development and other guidance, but the core things had to do with just regular job performance. The board had this very different perspective, much more macro in some ways. They wanted to see some holistic change. But, I don't think that everybody was ready for that.